Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going back in time, back to World War One, but with a twist. We're focusing on the American home front. Like you're prepping for this big presentation on the topic, and we're here to help you dig out the good stuff, the fascinating stuff the kind of insights that'll really make your audience pay attention.
Yeah, it's crazy how a war fought an ocean away
Yeah.
could completely transform American society. We're talking changes that lasted for decades,
Yeah.
even till today.
And we've got some great sources to work with, historical overviews and some really powerful images. Sometimes a picture really is worth 1,000 words.
Oh, absolutely, especially something like this.
Yeah.
Images can transport us back to that time. We can feel the emotions, see the world through their eyes.
Right. Okay, so let's set the stage. It's 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, and bam! Europe's tangled web of alliances explodes into World War One.
And this was not your typical war. This was brutal. We're talking machine guns, mowing down rows of soldiers, tanks, lumbering across battlefields, and the new terror, chemical weapons. The world had never seen anything like it.
It's hard to even imagine, and for Americans at first, it really did seem like an over-there problem. You can almost imagine them thinking, those Europeans, always fighting. But then things started to happen, things that hit closer to home.
Yeah. That's where things get really interesting. You see, it wasn't just the violence. It was these specific events. Events that felt like personal attacks.
Right. Like the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, over 1,000 people died, including over 100 Americans. Imagine reading about that, hearing the stories of the victims. Suddenly the war felt very real.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the Lusitania. You had the Zimmermann telegram, that intercepted message, where Germany tried to convince Mexico to join them against the U.S.
Oh, wow. That must have really fueled the anti-German feeling.
Absolutely. It was a major factor in pushing the U.S. towards war. Now, you might think declaring war in 1917 settled it.
Okay.
But that isolationist feeling, it didn't go away overnight. It would come back again later.
Wow. Okay, so the U.S. finally enters the war, but what did that really change? I mean, Europe had already been fighting for years.
Well, imagine two boxers, totally exhausted, barely standing, locked in a stalemate. That's what the Western Front was like by 1917. Then, boom, a fresh fighter enters the ring, the U.S.
Gotcha. So fresh troops. But it sounds like it was more than just that.
Right. American factories started producing like crazy. Weapons, ammunition, food, everything the Allies needed to keep fighting. Plus, they provided much-needed financial support. American involvement really tipped the scales and led to the Allied victory.
Wow. So they made a huge difference. I'm guessing this is where America steps onto the world stage in a big way.
Exactly. Their military got stronger. Their influence grew. It was a pivotal moment. It set the stage for America as a superpower. But we can't forget up back home on the American home front.
Right. Because while the soldiers were over there, life in America was transforming too. You can't send millions of men to war and expect everything to stay the same.
Right. It was total mobilization, like the entire nation became a giant machine focused on winning the war. The government created the War Industries Board to manage and increase production.
And everyone remembers those posters encouraging people to plant victory gardens. Who wouldn't want to help out by growing their own veggies?
It really captured the spirit of the time, this idea of shared sacrifice. And it wasn't just growing food. Remember Meatless Mondays?
Yeah.
The Food Administration wanted people to conserve resources. What's crazy is that a lot of this wasn't mandatory. People rationed food, fuel, even clothing. It was a totally different mindset.
Wow.
But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. There was a darker side to this unity, a side we need to talk about, to get the complete picture.
You're talking about the Espionage and Sedition Acts,
Virginia.
laws that were supposed to stop people from speaking out against the war.
Right. They were used to silence dissent, sometimes harshly. Socialist leader Eugene Debs was jailed for 10 years just for giving an anti-war speech. It brings up some tough questions about national security and individual freedom during wartime, questions that are still relevant today.
Absolutely. So you have this mix of patriotism, sacrifice, and unfortunately, suppression of dissent. But what about the economic impact? Wars are usually good for some industries.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The U.S. economy boomed during World War I. There was this huge demand for steel, ships, weapons, uniforms, everything. Factories were working nonstop. Unemployment was down, wages went up.
So the war was good for the economy.
For a short time, yes.
Yeah.
But this boom wasn't sustainable, and it hid some deeper problems that would show up later.
I see. So the good times couldn't last forever. But before we get to that, I want to hear more about those war bonds. Those posters were everywhere, telling people to do their bit.
They were brilliant. Not just a way to raise money for the war, but also a marketing campaign. Buying a bond became a patriotic act, like saying, I support this war.
Yeah. Right. It seems like they use the same kind of emotional appeal as propaganda. Those posters were powerful.
You got it. Propaganda was huge during World War I. The government, through organizations like the Committee on Public Information, went all out to shape public opinion.
Wow. So we've got wartime production,
Yeah.
war bonds, propaganda. It sounds like life on the home front was just as intense as the fighting overseas.
Absolutely. And those complexities didn't just vanish when the war ended. The war's end brought its own challenges and opportunities.
And that's what we'll be talking about next. So stay tuned as we explore the aftermath of World War I and its lasting impacts on American society. You won't want to miss it.
Welcome back. Before we went off, we were talking about how life on the American home front was just as intense and complex as the fighting overseas, and that those complexities didn't just disappear when the war ended.
Yeah, it's easy to think of history as just dates and battles, but it's really about the stories of people. So how did this war, with all its upheaval, change the lives of everyday Americans?
Well, think about it. This was a generation that saw unimaginable horrors. The war challenged their faith in humanity, in progress itself. They had to confront the dark side of human nature.
So it wasn't just about rationing and planting victory gardens. It was a deep psychological shift, too.
Exactly, and it played out in some interesting ways. Some Americans held even tighter to traditional values, looking for comfort in the familiar. Others embraced new ideas, pushing for change, like women's suffrage, for instance.
Right. The war really pushed women into new roles in the workforce and in society as a whole. It's like the old rules were being rewritten.
And you can't talk about social change without talking about the Great Migration. Millions of African Americans moved north, seeking better opportunities and escaping the Jim Crow South. This had a huge impact on demographics and race relations in the U.S.
And those shifts didn't always happen peacefully, did they? You mentioned the Red Summer of 1919 earlier, a period of terrible racial violence.
Unfortunately, that's the dark side of progress. The war might have united Americans against a common enemy overseas, but it also exposed deep divisions at home, divisions that sometimes led to violence.
It's like what we were saying about the Espionage and Sedition Acts. It seems like the war, in some ways, brought out both the best and worst in American society.
That's a really good observation, and it shows the complexity of the home front experience. It wasn't just unity and patriotism. There was fear, suspicion, and a struggle to define what it meant to be American in a world that was changing so fast.
So you've got these massive social and cultural shifts happening, but what about the economy? We talked about the wartime boom, but what happened after the fighting stopped?
Remember all those factories making war materials?
Yeah.
Well, peacetime brought a big drop in demand. Those factory orders disappeared, leading to layoffs and a sharp economic downturn.
That must have been hard for a lot of people, going from the intensity of the war years to this sudden uncertainty.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the government wasn't ready for this transition either. They had been so focused on winning the war that they hadn't really thought about what would happen afterwards.
So it wasn't just the economic impact, it was also a psychological adjustment, like a sense of loss almost.
That's a great point. People had lost loved ones. Their lives had been disrupted, and now they were facing an uncertain future. It's no wonder there was a rise in nativism and isolationism.
Like people wanted to just pull back from the world, to go back to a simpler time.
Right. But even as some Americans tried to turn inward, the war's legacies continued to shape their lives in big ways, whether they realized it or not.
This is all so interesting, and I can see how understanding all this would really make our listeners' presentation better. They're not just presenting facts, they're telling a story, painting a picture of a nation in transition.
Exactly. And don't forget about those images we talked about. A good image can be incredibly powerful.
Right. Okay, so interconnectedness, images, and this nuanced understanding of the home front experience. What else should our listener keep in mind as they get ready?
Well, they need to think about how they're going to connect this to their audience. Why should people today care about what happened 100 years ago?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is in the lasting legacies of World War I, how the effects of that conflict are still felt today.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be diving into next. So stay tuned as we explore how World War I continues to shape American society, even a century later.
We're back and ready to explore those lasting legacies of World War I. I think a lot of people might be surprised to learn just how much this conflict from over a century ago still shapes our world today.
It's true. We talked about all those changes, the social, economic, and political changes during the war. But they didn't just vanish when the fighting stopped. They kept evolving, echoing through the decades.
So what are some of the biggest ways that World War I still shapes American society. Where do we see its fingerprints most clearly?
Well, one of the most obvious is America's role in the world. Before the war, the U.S. was pretty isolated, focused on its own stuff. But World War I, it pushed America onto the world stage,
Yeah.
and they never really left.
That makes sense. We talked earlier about how American involvement helped win the war, and that had to have a big impact on their standing.
Absolutely, and it wasn't just military power. The war also established the U.S. as a major economic power, lending money to nations, a key supplier of all kinds of stuff.
So from then on, the U.S. was seen as a leader.
Exactly. And that really shaped American foreign policy for decades to come, shaping their role in everything, from World War II to the Cold War and beyond.
It's like World War I was the start of America becoming a superpower.
You could say that. And it also paved the way for many of the international organizations we have today, like the United Nations, which was created to prevent another World War I.
Okay, so that's the global impact. But what about domestically? How did World War I keep shaping American society at home?
Well, get back to some of those economic changes we discussed. The war led to the income tax. Love it or hate it, it's a cornerstone of the American tax system now.
And it wasn't just the income tax. The war also made war bonds popular as a way to show patriotism and fund the government.
Right, and that idea is still around today. Think about savings bonds, or how the government encourages investment in certain industries.
So even paying taxes has roots in World War I.
Exactly. And don't forget about the social and cultural changes. The war sped up the women's suffrage movement, leading to the 19th Amendment in 1920.
Right. It's hard to believe women couldn't vote back then. But that was the reality just over 100 years ago. And World War I helped change that.
It did. And the Great Migration that we talked about earlier had a lasting impact on demographics and culture in the U.S.
Wow. It's amazing to think how World War I had such a ripple effect, touching so many parts of American life, at home and abroad.
And that's why it's important to study history, to understand how the past shapes the present, and to see the connections we might miss otherwise.
I totally agree. And I think our listener is now equipped with some really great insights to make their presentations stand out.
They're not just going to give facts. They're going to take their audience on a journey, help them understand the human stories.
Right. Speaking of journeys, it's time to wrap up our own deep dive into World War I and the American Homefront.
We covered a lot today, from the shock of the war to the huge changes it brought about and the legacies that are still with us.
We hope you found it interesting and maybe even a bit inspiring. Remember, history isn't just a bunch of old facts. It's a living story, and we're all part of it.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deeper into the past. You never know what you might find.
And on that note, we'll say goodbye. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep those minds engaged.